Today is the first day of class. If you thought it was all about sunbathing on exotic islands and riding motorcycles, well, think again, because you are wrong. Today, we are actually learning something. I hope so. I'm starting a series explaining the elements and principles of photography, and today we start our journey with contrast. So what is contrast? What is exactly contrast? To put it into very simple terms, it's the difference between your life expectations when you're 20 and the reality of life in your 30s. But in photography, we tend to focus on contrast in terms of tone, so light and dark. However, contrast is more than that. Color, scale, texture, and narrative contrast, which can be a little subjective in some occasions. So let's explore these, beginning with tone. Contrast is the difference between the lighter and the darker parts of the image. A black circle over a white background is high contrast. The opposite is also true. But as we darken the background and move towards the middle tones between black and white, we begin to lose contrast. Why is contrast important? When creating images, we want to guide the viewer's eyes to the most important parts of the image. And contrast is one of the ways we can achieve this, since our eyes are drawn to the areas with most contrast. Also, with contrast, we can isolate our subjects from the background, like in this example here. I took this photograph a couple of years ago in the neighborhood of La Latina, here in Madrid. And despite the darkness in pretty much the whole image, we can see that the light creates a perfect outline of the woman's body with a thin but very distinct line. This difference between light and shadow isolates the subject from the background. A similar thing happens in this other image of Santa's little helper going out for a walk. I hope you know who Santa's little helper is. If not, well, you have some work to do. Once again, I shot against the light to create a perfect silhouette of the dog. However, in this occasion, the background is quite bright and the subject is able to pop a little bit more than in the previous image. In this example, our subjects are trying to enjoy the warm sunshine of Madrid. Actually not so warm because I took this at the beginning of December, but in this cold weather, any sun is more than welcome to stay. Our subjects stand in the lighter areas and there is high contrast with the rest of the image, especially the foreground, which is quite dark. It's the brighter parts of the image that captivate our attention and tell us where to look. What I love about this image is the peaceful feeling that I get, because contrast is also an emotional storyteller. As a general rule, high contrast images are bold and dynamic, while low contrast ones are serene, calm, and have a dreamlike feeling. But it's not always the case, as we saw in the previous example. One thing to have in mind is that these are not set rules. Although dark tones are typically moody, they can also be peaceful. It's all about personal interpretation and what we want to communicate in that moment. And also what the scene wants to communicate to us. So next time you're in front of a scene, ask yourself, how does this scene make me feel? What's the story here? What's being communicated? And how can I express that? This is about point of view. And I don't mean point of view in the sense of angles and positions from which a photo is taken. I mean the unique perspective and interpretation of oneself. We will talk about this in the future because it's here where our individuality starts to shine. Maybe you find great calmness in darkness. Find a way to show that. Color contrast is the difference between two colors. And color contrast typically involves colors that are opposite each other on the wheel. We call these complementary colors. For example, red and green. This image caught my attention for 3 reasons. The message written on the bench, which says "Te amé con locura," I loved you madly, which is a great narrative. Also because there are 3 benches that create a visual pattern or repetition, and finally because there's color contrast, red against green. Another example is this photo I took of a wedding I crashed last year. I told everyone I was a distant cousin of somebody's cousin, and no one noticed, I think. But beyond this wedding story, notice the purples and the yellows against the men's gray suits. These colors, purple and yellow, are complementary, and they add a vibrant splash to the monochrome suits. Scale is a fun one for me. Especially during my travels, I tend to use it often since I like to show the greatness of nature against the human form or some human-made objects, like this image I shot from a motorcycle trip in Lanzarote. This tiny house surrounded by the vast volcanic landscape shows scale contrast. It's also a good example of tone contrast, the white house against the dark volcanic rock. Another example is this photo of La Sagrada Familia in Barcelona. The cathedral's size compared to the surrounding buildings really emphasizes its majesty. The greatness of this monument could also be captured from a lower angle, but by showing the difference in sizes, we have a completely different story. This is where things start to get interesting, since narrative contrast is subjective and varies based on our perspectives. Sometimes the narrative can be very clear, and other times we can have different opinions on what we see. For example, I could say this image has contrast. A traffic sign in the middle of the mountains. Man versus nature. Actually, if you're interested in landscape photography, adding man-made elements in nature can enhance the narrative of the scene. James Popsys is a photographer who often explores this theme, and he has a fantastic channel, so go check him out now. Well, after you finish watching this. And last but not least, this photo is also a good example of narrative contrast. The chaotic graffiti in an urban setting in the foreground, and in the background, the order of a religious institution. It's actually a school. To me, this is the clash between chaos and order. So that's a wrap on contrast. And now it's time to practice. But before you go, just a little advice. When you're out practicing, don't worry too much about the outcome. And remember that when you are trying to express your vision, don't be afraid of breaking the rules, because we want to see your unique point of view. So let yourself be present in the moment and use these tools and elements to communicate your vision. But like I said, we will talk about this in the future. For now, it's time to focus on contrast.